In the smoking ruins of 1945, as the world cheered for an elusive peace, two titans prepared for a new war that history almost forgot. Winston Churchill and George Patton watched the Soviet shadow grow across Europe, sensing that the fall of Berlin was merely the prelude to a global catastrophe. Could the Western Allies have crushed the Red Army before the Iron Curtain fell forever? The echoes of celebration in London and New York had barely faded before the cold reality of a fractured continent began to set in for those who truly understood the geography of power. While the masses danced in the streets to mark the surrender of Nazi Germany, Winston Churchill sat in the subterranean depths of the cabinet war rooms, surrounded by the stale smell of cigar smoke and old maps, his mind already racing toward a conflict that the public could not yet imagine. He looked at the gargantuan maps of Central Europe, where the crimson lines of the Red Army had surged forward like an unstoppable tidal wave, pushing far beyond the demarcations agreed upon at the Yalta Conference, as he realized with a sinking heart that the hard-won liberation of the continent had merely traded one totalitarian master for another. Across the English Channel, General George S. Patton stood amidst the charred remains of Bavaria, his ivory-hilted revolvers catching the dim light of a setting sun as he surveyed a landscape teeming with displaced persons and the victorious but exhausted soldiers of the Third Army. Unlike the politicians in Washington who still clung to the hope of a lasting partnership with Joseph Stalin, Patton viewed the Soviet Union with a visceral, instinctive hostility that bordered on the prophetic, believing himself to be a reincarnated warrior destined to fight the ultimate battle between East and West. He saw the massed ranks of Soviet T-34 tanks and the endless columns of infantry as a primitive, unstoppable force that would not stop until they reached the Atlantic Ocean, unless someone possessed the courage to strike them while the American war machine was still at its peak. Just like that, the fragile unity of the Big Three began to disintegrate under the weight of geopolitical necessity and raw military ambition. Churchill, the aging lion of British imperialism, found himself in a desperate race against time to convince the Americans that the Soviet threat was not a distant possibility, but an immediate and existential danger to Western civilization. He drafted telegram after telegram to President Harry Truman, using the phrase Iron Curtain for the first time to describe the impenetrable barrier being lowered across the heart of Europe by the Soviet secret police and the Red Army, warned that Stalin was not a partner in peace but a predator waiting for the West to disarm. However, the commander of the Allied forces, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, found himself caught in a grueling middle ground between the political demands of the White House and the aggressive impulses of his most brilliant but volatile field commander. Eisenhower viewed his primary mission as the complete and orderly dissolution of the German military and the maintenance of a working relationship with the Soviet high command to ensure that the final days of the war did not devolve into a chaotic free-for-all that would alienate Moscow. He watched with growing frustration as Patton began to publicly and privately advocate for a preemptive strike against the Russians, fearing that the general's mouth would ignite a spark that could not be extinguished before the American public was ready for another crusade. Suddenly, the atmosphere in the high command turned toxic as the reality of Soviet occupation in Poland and Czechoslovakia became undeniable to the military planners in London, who saw the NKVD arresting democratic leaders in broad daylight. Churchill, fueled by a mixture of whiskey and a deep-seated fear for the future of the British Empire, ordered his chiefs of staff to prepare a top-secret plan for an offensive against the Soviet Union to commence on July 1st, 1945. This plan, which would later be titled Operation Unthinkable, was born out of the sheer desperation of a man who realized that the victory for which he had sacrificed everything was about to be stolen by a tyrant who was even more formidable than the one they had just defeated. The strategic dilemma was staggering because the Red Army currently enjoyed a numerical superiority in Europe of nearly 4-1, with millions of battle-hardened soldiers occupying the strategic high ground from the Baltic to the Adriatic. To Churchill and Patton, the only solution was to leverage the technological and industrial might of the United States before the American public demanded the return of their sons and the dismantling of the greatest army the world had ever seen. Patton argued with a fiery intensity that the Americans should not be sending their tanks back to the States, but rather fueling them up for a drive toward Moscow, claiming that he could have the Red Army on the run within weeks if given the green light and enough gasoline. Immediately, the tension between Patton and the Allied leadership reached a breaking point during a series of heated dinners and briefings, where the general openly insulted the Soviet officers and questioned the intelligence of anyone who believed Stalin's promises of free elections. He viewed the Russians not as allies, but as a Mongol horde that had no respect for human life or the conventions of civilized warfare. And he was convinced that the only language they understood was the language of superior firepower and armored thrusts. He famously remarked that they had defeated the wrong enemy, a statement that sent shockwaves through the diplomatic circles of the newly formed United Nations. But while Patton was advocating for a kinetic solution on the ground, Churchill was orchestrating a much larger and more dangerous game of shadows in the halls of power. He knew that the British military was exhausted, its treasury empty, and its people weary of 6 years of total war. Yet he refused to accept a world where half of Europe was enslaved by communism. He pushed his planners to consider the use of rearmed German Wehrmacht divisions to bolster the Allied lines, a move so radical and controversial that it would have shattered the moral foundations of the anti-Axis alliance and potentially triggered a mutiny among Western troops. The psychological aspect of this leadership crisis was profound, as men like Eisenhower and Bradley felt the crushing weight of history on their shoulders, knowing that one wrong move could trigger a conflict that would dwarf the horrors of the war they had just finished. They saw Patton as a dangerous relic of a bygone era of warrior kings, a man who loved the smell of cordite more than the prospect of peace, and yet they could not deny his brilliance on the battlefield or his ability to inspire men to do the impossible. In their eyes, Patton was a firebrand that needed to be doused, while Churchill was a ghost of the past, haunting the hopes for a peaceful future. In London, the military staff worked in total secrecy on the details of Operation Unthinkable, calculating the exact number of divisions, the tonnage of supplies, and the projected casualties of a sudden assault against the Soviet forces in occupied Germany. They envisioned a massive air campaign using the full weight of the Royal Air Force and the United States Army Air Forces that would paralyze Soviet communications, followed by a lightning strike by armored columns through the North German plain. This strategy mirrored the very blitzkrieg that had nearly destroyed them years earlier. But this time, it would be aimed at the very allies who had helped them win. But as the days of May 1945 ticked by, the window of opportunity for such a radical move began to close as the political landscape shifted toward Reconstruction and the brutal reality of the Pacific Theater. Churchill felt the tide of history pulling away from him, his influence in Washington waning as the new administration of Harry Truman focused on ending the war with Japan and stabilizing the global economy through the Bretton Woods system. Truman was increasingly wary of Churchill's old-world imperialist ambitions and preferred to seek a diplomatic solution with Stalin, at least until he knew the results of the Manhattan Project. Patton, sensing the hesitation of his superiors and the growing apathy of the high command, grew more reckless in his public statements, eventually leading to a series of PR disasters regarding his use of former Nazi officials for administrative tasks. The man who had liberated thousands of miles of territory and saved the Allied line at the Battle of the Bulge found himself relegated to the role of a military governor in Bavaria, a position he loathed with every fiber of his being. He felt the world was moving toward a bland, bureaucratic existence that had no place for a man of his temperament or his violent talents. Despite the official silencing of Patton, the underlying conflict between the East and West continued to simmer, fueled by the aggressive expansion of Soviet influence in every city the Red Army occupied. Churchill watched with a growing sense of helplessness as the Soviet secret police, the NKVD, began to arrest and execute the democratic leaders and resistance fighters of the very countries the Allies had set out to save. The promise of the Atlantic Charter was being systematically dismantled by the Lublin Polses and other Soviet-backed groups, while the West looked on in stunned silence. The crisis of 1945 was not just a military problem, but a crisis of the Western soul, as the leaders of the free world grappled with the question of whether they were willing to start a third world war to finish the job of the second. In the quiet moments of the night, even the most hawkish planners had to wonder if the price of stopping Stalin was a price that the world could actually afford to pay in the wake of the Holocaust. They stood on the precipice of a new era, knowing that the decision to act or remain idle would define the next century of human history. The strategic silence of the Allied High Command in the summer of 1945 was not a sign of peace, but a symptom of a paralyzing internal struggle that threatened to ignite a Third World War before the smoke of the Second had even cleared. Winston Churchill and George Patton were effectively screaming into a void, their warnings about the Soviet Union falling on the ears of a Washington administration that was desperate to bring the boys home. As the Red Army tightened its grip on the throat of Eastern Europe, the disparity in raw military power became the central obsession of the planners in London, who realized that the Western Allies were rapidly losing their window of superiority as their divisions were dismantled for discharge. The sheer scale of the Soviet juggernaut was a mathematical nightmare for anyone looking at the maps in the War Office, as Stalin had amassed over 6 million soldiers in the European theater, supported by an armor force that dwarfed everything the Americans and British could put into the field. The Soviet infantry was a battle-hardened machine that had survived the furnace of Stalingrad and the massive tank battles of Kursk, and they were now fueled by a fanatical sense of victory and a thirst for vengeance against anything Western. Churchill knew that if a conflict began, the Red Army would likely reach the Rhine within days, potentially pushing the Allied forces back into the sea in a second Dunkirk that would end Western influence on the continent for a generation or more. Just like that, the technical experts began comparing the lethality of Western technology against Soviet mass, noting that while the American P-51 Mustangs and British Spitfires held the edge in the skies, the ground war was a different story entirely. The Soviet ES-2 heavy tanks, with their massive 122mm guns, were capable of shattering American Shermans from distances that made Allied crews feel like sitting ducks in steel coffins. Patton, ever the student of tank warfare, obsessed over these details, demanding that the new M26 Pershing tanks be rushed to the front lines to give his men a fighting chance against the Red Beast he so desperately wanted to slay before it grew any stronger. Immediately, the planners of Operation Unthinkable identified the North German plain as the primary killing field where the fate of the world would be decided, envisioning a massive pincer movement designed to trap the Soviet forces before they could mobilize their full reserve strength. The plan called for the liberation of Poland as the primary objective, a goal that would satisfy the moral obligation the British had felt since 1939, but the logistics were terrifyingly complex. It would require the total mobilization of the remaining German rail networks and the use of over 100,000 surrendered German soldiers, men who had been fighting the Russians for years and were more than willing to pick up their rifles again. But while the military maps showed lines of advance and retreat, the political reality in Washington was moving in the opposite direction as President Harry Truman grappled with the legacy of Franklin Roosevelt and the looming shadow of the atomic bomb. Truman was not yet convinced that the Soviet Union was an irreconcilable enemy, and he feared that any aggressive move in Europe would jeopardize the Soviet entry into the war against Japan, which was still seen as a necessity. He viewed Patton's rhetoric as a liability, and Churchill's pleas as the desperate maneuvers of a fading empire trying to maintain its relevance in a world now dominated by two new superpowers. Suddenly, the internal pressure on Patton reached a boiling point as he was ordered to begin the systematic demobilization of his Third Army, a command he followed with a bitterness that he could barely contain. He watched as his veteran units, the men who had cracked the Siegfried Line and raced across the heart of Germany, were broken up and replaced by green recruits who had no understanding of the enemy they were facing across the demarcation line. To Patton, this was more than just a military mistake. It was a betrayal of the dead, a surrender of the very freedom they had fought to secure, and he began to express these views to anyone who would listen, including the press and his own diary. The consequence of this outspoken defiance was swift and brutal, as Eisenhower and the War Department moved to strip Patton of his command, effectively ending the military career of the most successful combat general in American history. They moved him to a ceremonial post in the 15th Army, a paper headquarters designed to write the history of the war rather than fight it, a move that felt to Patton like being buried alive. He spent his days in a state of growing despair, writing in his diary about the cowards in Washington and the inevitable war with Russia that would kill millions because the current leaders lacked the stomach to fight it now while they had the advantage. In London, Churchill faced his own reckoning as the British general election of July 1945 approached, an event that would change the course of history as much as any battle. Despite his status as the savior of the nation, the British people were exhausted by years of rationing, bombing, and sacrifice, and they turned their backs on the Conservative Party in favor of the Labour Party's promises. Just like that, the man who had been the primary architect of the resistance against both Hitler and Stalin was cast out of power, leaving Operation Unthinkable to gather dust in the secret archives of a government that no longer had the will to execute it. Immediately, the Soviet intelligence services, who had infiltrated the British and American governments at almost every level, realized that the threat of a Western preemptive strike had vanished with the removal of Churchill and the silencing of Patton. Stalin moved with ruthless efficiency to consolidate his gains, installing puppet regimes in Warsaw, Budapest, and Bucharest, and turning the Soviet occupation zone in Germany into a fortress of communist ideology. The window for a liberation of Eastern Europe had slammed shut, replaced by the grim reality of a continent divided by a line of concrete, barbed wire, and the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation as the Cold War began in earnest. However, the tragedy of 1945 was not yet complete, as a final dark chapter awaited the man who had been the most vocal advocate for a different path. In December of that year, as Patton prepared to leave Germany and return to the United States, where he intended to resign and tell the truth to the American people about the Soviet threat, his car was involved in a low-speed collision with a military truck. While the other occupants of the vehicle walked away with minor scratches, Patton was thrown forward, striking his head and suffering a broken neck that left him paralyzed from the neck down. But the circumstances of the accident and the subsequent treatment of the general fueled a firestorm of rumors that have persisted for decades, with many suggesting that the accident was a staged assassination by either the NKVD or the American OSS. Those who believe in the conspiracy point to the fact that the truck driver was never prosecuted, the official reports were riddled with inconsistencies, and Patton was on the verge of becoming a major political problem for the Truman administration. He lingered in a hospital in Heidelberg for 12 days, his body failing even as his mind remained sharp, until he finally succumbed to a pulmonary edema, dying far from the battlefield he loved and the war he so desperately wanted to lead. The death of Patton marked the symbolic end of the warrior general era and the beginning of the age of the bureaucrat commander, as the cold, calculated logic of the Cold War took hold of the global imagination. Churchill, now in the political wilderness, watched from the sidelines as his Iron Curtain speech in Fulton, Missouri, finally awakened the American public to the danger he had seen years earlier. But it was too late to change the borders of Europe. The Red Army was no longer an ally to be managed, but a permanent adversary to be contained, and the world entered a 40-year stalemate that would bring humanity to the brink of destruction multiple times. Suddenly, the historical analysis of Operation Unthinkable reveals a terrifying truth about the limits of power and the nature of victory in the 20th century. Had the Allies launched the attack, they might have succeeded in pushing the Soviets back to their 1939 borders, but at the cost of millions more lives and the potential destruction of European civilization. Yet by choosing peace in 1945, they condemned half of the continent to decades of oppression and created a nuclear arms race that drained the resources of the planet for half a century. The tactical execution of such a war would have been a chaotic nightmare, with the possibility of the Soviets using their own secret weapons and scorched earth tactics that had defeated Napoleon and Hitler. We must consider the psychological toll on the soldiers who had already seen enough death to last a lifetime, being asked to turn their guns on the men they had shared cigarettes with just weeks prior. The human cost of the decision to not fight is measured in the mass graves of the Soviet gulags and the silenced voices of the millions who lived or died behind the Berlin Wall, a consequence that Patton and Churchill saw coming with terrifying clarity. As we look back at the smoking ruins of that era, we are left with the image of two men standing against the tide of history, one a cigar-chomping statesman and the other a pearl-handled general, both convinced that the world was making a fatal mistake. Their failure to convince their peers led to a world of shadows, spies, and proxy wars, a world where the victory of 1945 felt forever incomplete. The story of Patton and Churchill's lost war is a reminder that in the game of empires, the most dangerous moment is not the heat of battle, but the deceptive calm that follows the final shot. If the Western Allies had followed Patton's advice and attacked the Soviet Union in 1945, do you believe the world would be a more peaceful place today? Or would it have led to a nuclear catastrophe we wouldn't have survived? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.